The night before Helm's Deep breaks open, something far more fragile than stone walls is already failing. Across the plains of Rohan, beneath banners hastily raised and oaths spoken too late, a new kind of enemy is moving, one that does not belong cleanly to any age of Middle-earth. They are not merely orcs, yet not fully men. They march with discipline, endure the sun, speak with voices sharpened by command rather than instinct, and carry within them a quiet horror that Tolkien intended us to notice but rarely to name. Because if we misunderstand what the Uruk-hai truly are, we misunderstand the nature of evil's evolution in Middle-earth itself. What is actually at stake here is not taxonomy, not whether one creature is taller or stronger than another, but whether corruption in Tolkien's world is static or adaptive. The difference between goblins, orcs, half-orcs, and Uruk-hai marks a shift from raw, chaotic malice towards something far more dangerous. Evil that learns, refines itself, and weaponizes the strengths of its enemies. This is not simply a matter of breeding pits and dark experiments. It is a philosophical turning point in the history of Arda, where domination begins to masquerade as progress. Most readers and viewers flatten these distinctions into visual shorthand. Goblins are the small ones from the mountains. Orcs are the standard foot soldiers. Uruk-hai are the big armored brutes who run fast and shout louder. Half-orcs are either ignored entirely or confused with Saruman's creations. This reduction is understandable, especially given the film's necessary compression, but it erases the most unsettling truth Tolkien embeds beneath the surface. These are not just different species, but different strategies of evil responding to different ages of resistance. To see this clearly, we must begin with the oldest term, goblin. In Tolkien's own usage, goblin is not a separate biological category from orc at all, but a linguistic and cultural one. In The Hobbit, goblin is the word used by Bilbo and the dwarves, filtered through a more fairy tale register to describe what the Lord of the Rings later names orcs. The creatures of the Misty Mountains, the tunnels under the High Pass, and the halls beneath Goblin Town are orcs by nature, even if their size, organization, and temperament differ from those bred later in Mordor or Isengard. Their cruelty is impulsive, their societies unstable, their violence more reactive than strategic. They thrive in darkness, not merely because they hate the sun, but because their entire way of being is parasitic on neglect, fear, and decay. This matters because it establishes a baseline. Early orcs, whether we call them goblins or not, are fundamentally broken things. Tolkien never allows us to forget that they are twisted from something that was once capable of harmony, whether elvish or otherwise, and this metaphysical damage limits them. They squabble, they betray one another. They require constant domination from a Dark Lord to function at scale. Left alone, they collapse into infighting and petty tyranny. The Uruk-hai are different, not because they are stronger, though they are. Not because they can endure sunlight, though they can. But because they represent an answer to a problem Sauron and Saruman both recognize: raw malice is inefficient. Chaos cannot win wars against cultures bound by loyalty, memory, and purpose. So the solution is not more orcs, but better ones. Orcs reshaped to suppress internal weakness, trained to obey hierarchy, stripped of tribal fragmentation, and forced into something resembling industrialized warfare. The term Uruk itself is telling. It is not merely a name, but a claim of primacy. In the Black speech, it means orc, but with an implication of purity or superiority. Orc perfected, not diminished. When Saruman adopts this language, branding his forces the Uruk-hai, he is not imitating Sauron accidentally. He is aligning himself with a deeper doctrine, that evil must evolve or perish. And yet, this evolution requires compromise. To create the Uruk-hai of Isengard, Saruman does something Sauron himself had been more cautious about in the Third Age. He crosses orc with man, not metaphorically, but literally. This is where half-orcs enter the story, not as a footnote, but as a moral rupture. These beings walk openly among men, especially in the Shire and in Bree, passing unnoticed or merely unsettling, because they are close enough to humanity to infiltrate it. Their existence proves that Saruman's war is not only against kingdoms, but against boundaries themselves, between species, between moral categories, between what is fallen and what is still redeemable. This is why Tolkien treats half-orcs with such quiet dread. They are not battlefield monsters. They are spies, overseers, agents of corruption embedded within civil society. They signal a shift from conquest to subversion, from open war to systemic decay. And once that line is crossed, Middle-earth can no longer rely on distance or walls to protect itself. Understanding these distinctions changes how we read every major conflict of the late Third Age. Helm's Deep is not simply a siege, it is a trial run for a new model of domination. The Scouring of the Shire is not an epilogue, it is proof that Saruman's methods work disturbingly well. And the question Tolkien forces us to confront is not whether these creatures are evil, but whether evil that learns restraint, discipline, and imitation is more dangerous than evil that merely hates. Because once darkness learns how to look almost like order, the war is no longer only fought on the battlefield. The deeper danger, however, lies in the fact that this evolution of orc kind mirrors the internal decay of the free peoples themselves. Tolkien is never accidental in his parallels. As the kingdoms of men centralize power, professionalize armies, and distance rulers from the lived moral realities of their people, evil responds in kind, not by opposing structure, but by perfecting it without conscience. The Uruk-hai are not simply soldiers. They are a critique made flesh, reflecting what warfare becomes when efficiency is severed from mercy. This is why Tolkien is so careful to distinguish Uruk-hai from the orcs of Mordor, even though both serve Sauron's ultimate design. The Uruks of Mordor, first appearing openly during the War of the Ring, are larger and more formidable than earlier orcs, but they remain bound to Sauron's will in a way that preserves their internal fragility. They still fear punishment more than they believe in purpose. Saruman's Uruk-hai, by contrast, are conditioned to internalize command. They chant his name, they compete for honor. They exhibit a grim pride that borders on loyalty, not because they understand good, but because they have been trained to replace conscience with identity. This distinction becomes clearest in how these forces behave under pressure. When the orcs of Mordor quarrel over Frodo's belongings in Cirith Ungol, the entire tower collapses into self-destruction. Their hierarchy exists only so long as fear is immediate. Remove the overseer, and the structure devours itself. But at Helm's Deep, the Uruk-hai press forward even as ladders burn and bodies pile against the walls. They advance not because they are fearless, but because retreat has been psychologically erased as an option. This is not courage, it is the annihilation of moral choice. Here, Tolkien is drawing on a deeper metaphysical rule of Arda. Evil cannot create, but it can refine corruption. Morgoth could only twist what already existed, but Sauron learned how to systematize that twisting, and Saruman learned how to imitate the surface virtues of order, learning, and industry, while hollowing them out from within. The Uruk-hai are the product of this intellectual betrayal. They are not born into darkness blindly, they are engineered for it. Half-orcs represent an even more unsettling threshold. Tolkien never gives us a full biological treatise on their nature, and that ambiguity is intentional. What matters is not the mechanics of their creation, but their function. They blur the line between enemy and neighbor. They erode trust. They force characters and readers to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil does not always announce itself with claws and red eyes. Sometimes it wears familiar features, speaks in half-known accents, and works within the machinery of everyday life. This is why the Shire's fall under Sharky's rule feels so wrong, so violating. It is not conquered by orc armies, but managed by men who have learned orcish methods. The presence of half-orcs among them is a symbol, not merely of Saruman's reach, but of the success of his philosophy. Evil has learned to outsource its brutality, to let others enforce its will, and in doing so, to escape easy identification. When we place goblins back into this framework, their role becomes tragically diminished. They are remnants of an earlier phase of corruption, cruel, yes, but ultimately limited. They terrorize, they plunder, they enslave, but they do not reorganize the world. Their evil is local, not systemic. They are symptoms, not architects. The Uruk-hai and half-orcs, by contrast, are instruments of redesign. They exist to reshape societies, to break resistance not only through force, but through exhaustion, infiltration, and moral confusion. This progression explains why Tolkien never allows the victory over Sauron to feel complete until Saruman is undone, and even then not triumphantly. Saruman represents the future Sauron was moving toward: domination through administration, cruelty justified as necessity, and obedience enforced not by terror alone but by normalization. His creations are therefore not merely monsters, but warnings. Understanding this reframes the entire legendarium's treatment of evil races. Tolkien is not interested in simple binaries of good peoples versus bad peoples. He is tracing how moral collapse expresses itself differently depending on context, opportunity, and intellect. Goblins are what happens when corruption is crude and unchecked. Orcs are what happens when it is organized but still internally unstable. Uruk-hai are what happens when it learns discipline without wisdom. Half-orcs are what happens when it learns disguise. And this leads us to the most uncomfortable implication of all. The closer evil comes to resembling the structures of the good, the harder it is to fight without becoming what one opposes. The War of the Ring is not won by outproducing or outbreeding the enemy, but by refusing to adopt his logic. Mercy, restraint, and humility are not sentimental virtues in Tolkien's world. They are strategic necessities, the only forces that corruption cannot fully anticipate or replicate. This is why the distinction between these beings matters so profoundly. They are not just creatures of flesh and bone, but milestones along a moral descent. Each represents a step further away from chaos and closer to something far colder and more efficient, a darkness that does not rage blindly but calculates. And once evil learns how to calculate, the age itself begins to fail. By the time we reach the end of the Third Age, Tolkien has quietly positioned these distinctions as a kind of moral archaeology. The creatures that march, spy, and govern are the visible layers of an older collapse, each one revealing how power has been misused across centuries. What appears on the surface as a question of breeding or strength is in fact a record of how domination adapts to resistance, and how every attempt to master others leaves a permanent scar on the world itself. This is why Tolkien is so careful never to let us see Uruk-hai or half-orcs as fully autonomous actors. They possess initiative, even cunning, but never true freedom. Their wills are bent, not erased, and that distinction is crucial. In Tolkien's metaphysics, the complete annihilation of free will would be an act of creation, something evil cannot achieve. Instead, what we see is the systematic narrowing of choice, until obedience becomes the path of least suffering. The Uruk-hai do not choose Saruman because they believe in him. They choose him because their entire existence has been shaped so that no alternative feels imaginable. This sheds new light on why Tolkien refuses to resolve the origin of orcs cleanly, despite decades of reflection. The question of whether orcs were once elves, men, or some other corrupted beings is not left open because Tolkien lacked an answer, but because the horror does not lie in the beginning, but in the persistence. Once corruption is entrenched, it reproduces itself across generations, no longer requiring a single act of blasphemous creation, but sustained by systems, incentives, and fear. The Uruk-hai are not a new sin. They are an old one, optimized. Half-orcs push this optimization into the realm of culture. Their presence signals that domination has learned to work through social structures rather than against them. They enforce rules, collect resources, and interpret orders, functioning as intermediaries between overt tyranny and ordinary life. In doing so, they make oppression feel procedural rather than violent. This is one of Tolkien's most devastating insights, that evil becomes hardest to resist when it presents itself as administration rather than invasion. Seen this way, the Scouring of the Shire is not an appendix, but a thesis statement. The hobbits defeat Saruman not by superior force, but by reclaiming moral agency at the local level. They remember who they are. They refuse the logic that says efficiency justifies cruelty or that order excuses dehumanization. Saruman's fall is not marked by a final battle, but by irrelevance. His methods work only where people forget their own worth. The Goblins, in contrast, cannot sustain such a system. Their societies are too fractured, their loyalties too brittle. They require constant external pressure to function, and without it, they revert to chaos. This is why they vanish from the center of the narrative as the War of the Ring intensifies. They are no longer the primary threat, not because they are less evil, but because they represent an older, less sophisticated form of it. The real danger has moved on. All of this culminates in Tolkien's final warning, delivered not through speeches, but through outcomes. The most powerful enemies are defeated not when they are destroyed, but when their logic is rejected. Sauron falls because he cannot conceive of mercy as strength. Saruman falls because he believes control is the same as wisdom. Their creations, no matter how refined, inherit these blind spots. The Uruk-hai can march and obey, but they cannot imagine a world not defined by command. The half-orcs can infiltrate and administer, but they cannot inspire loyalty rooted in love or trust. This is the buried meaning behind Tolkien's careful distinctions. He is not cataloging monsters, he is charting the anatomy of decline. Each creature marks a stage where power has been chosen over stewardship, order over justice, efficiency over compassion. And each stage brings the world closer to a kind of victory that is indistinguishable from ruin. The tragedy is not that these beings exist, but that they are effective. They work, they conquer, they impose peace of a sort. And it is precisely because they succeed that Tolkien insists we look at them closely, without simplification or comfort. Because if we fail to recognize how evil adapts, learns, and disguises itself, we risk believing that it only ever comes howling out of the dark. In Middle-earth, as in our own histories, the most dangerous corruption is not the one that hates openly, but the one that claims to know better. And this is where Tolkien's worldview finally closes the circle, revealing why the question of orcs, goblins, Uruk-hai, and half-orcs is not a matter of lore trivia, but a moral anatomy lesson written across an entire age. Because the endpoint of this progression is not simply darker armies, but a world in which moral language itself begins to collapse. When domination becomes normalized, when cruelty is reframed as necessity, when obedience is mistaken for strength, even the free peoples risk internalizing the very logic they oppose. This is why Tolkien repeatedly emphasizes limits. Limits on power, on knowledge, on intervention. The wise do not breed armies. The elves do not seek dominion. Gandalf refuses authority not out of humility alone, but because he understands that the means shape the end. To defeat an enemy who has optimized corruption, one must refuse optimization itself. This is the paradox at the heart of the War of the Ring. Victory depends not on superior force, but on restraint that looks, from a purely strategic standpoint, irrational. The creatures bred by Saruman and Sauron cannot understand this. Their entire existence presupposes that power justifies itself through results. They are built for a world where victory is measurable, where domination is proof of correctness. This is why the ring's destruction is inconceivable to Sauron, and why Saruman cannot imagine being ignored into irrelevance. Their creations inherit this blindness. Uruk-hai can execute orders flawlessly, but they cannot comprehend sacrifice without reward. Half-orcs can manage systems of control, but they cannot inspire allegiance rooted in love. Goblins can terrorize, but they cannot build anything that endures. Tolkien's deepest warning lies here. Evil does not need to win forever. It only needs to convince others to play by its rules. The moment good abandons mercy for efficiency or stewardship for control, the distinction between ruler and tyrant begins to erode. This is why Aragorn's kingship matters so profoundly. He does not rule through fear or domination, but through restoration of laws, of memory, of dignity. His authority heals rather than reorganizes. In Tolkien's moral universe, that difference is everything. Seen in this light, the taxonomy of these creatures becomes a map of temptation. Goblins represent raw cruelty, unchecked by reflection. Orcs represent cruelty organized by fear. Uruk-hai represent cruelty refined by intellect. Half-orcs represent cruelty hidden within civilization itself. None of these stages are inevitable, but each becomes more difficult to resist the longer it is allowed to persist. And this is why Tolkien never gives us a clean answer about redemption for orc kind. Not because he denies the possibility in principle, but because the systems that sustain corruption make redemption unimaginably costly. Mercy remains morally necessary, but it is no longer strategically convenient. That tension is not a flaw in Tolkien's world building. It is the point. Evil thrives where mercy becomes too expensive to practice. In the end, the War of the Ring is won not because the free peoples outmatch their enemies, but because they refuse to become what those enemies have become. The distinctions between goblins, orcs, Uruk-hai, and half-orcs exist to remind us that evil does not arrive fully formed. It progresses, it adapts, it learns. And unless it is confronted at the level of principle rather than power, it will always return in a more efficient shape. This is Tolkien's final warning, spoken not through prophecy, but through pattern, that the greatest victories are invisible, and the greatest defeats occur long before the walls fall. Because when a society begins to believe that domination is wisdom, that obedience is virtue, and that efficiency excuses cruelty, it has already begun breeding its own Uruk-hai. And if Tolkien leaves us unsettled here, it is because he intends to. The legendarium does not offer the comfort of a world neatly purged of its corruptions. Even after Sauron's fall, even after Saruman's voice is silenced, the structures that allowed such beings to exist do not vanish overnight. Roads remain. Mills remain. Habits of thought remain. The shadow is not merely an external force defeated in battle. It is a way of seeing the world that must be unlearned, slowly and deliberately, by those who survive it. This is why Tolkien frames the end of the Third Age as a time not of triumph, but of diminishing. The elves depart. The Age of Wonder recedes. What remains is responsibility. Men inherit the world not because they are purer, but because they are still undecided. Their fate is not fixed, and that uncertainty is both their greatest danger and their greatest hope. Unlike orcs and their derivatives, men can still choose not to optimize cruelty, not to normalize domination, not to confuse power with wisdom. The creatures bred in darkness are trapped within the logic that created them. Goblins cannot imagine peace. Orcs cannot imagine loyalty without fear. Uruk-hai cannot imagine obedience without annihilating the self. Half-orcs cannot imagine belonging without erasing difference. These are not merely traits, they are prisons of thought. The tragedy is not only what they do, but what they are no longer able to conceive. Tolkien's moral universe turns on this axis of imagination. Good endures because it can envision an end beyond victory. Evil persists because it cannot imagine anything but control. This is why the smallest characters carry the greatest weight. Hobbits, who never sought power, are the only ones capable of destroying it. Their resistance is not ideological or strategic. It is existential. They simply refuse to accept that domination is normal. Seen this way, the distinctions between these creatures are not about hierarchy, but about loss. Each step from goblin to orc, from orc to Uruk-hai, from Uruk-hai to half-orc, marks the removal of another human or once human possibility. Spontaneity, fellowship, moral hesitation, the ability to say no. What is gained in strength is paid for in interior emptiness. This is why Tolkien never glamorizes these beings, even when they appear formidable. Their discipline is sterile, their courage is coerced, their unity is enforced. They are terrifying not because they are powerful, but because they represent a future where power has replaced meaning entirely. A world where efficiency has devoured ethics, and where order survives only by hollowing out the soul. The enduring relevance of this question, what separates goblins, orcs, Uruk-hai, and half-orcs, is that it asks us to look beyond appearances and ask what kind of world produces such creatures in the first place. Not what they look like, not how strong they are, but what has been surrendered to make them possible. Because in Tolkien's world, evil is never an accident. It is always the result of choices made earlier, compromises accepted quietly, and principles abandoned in the name of necessity. The monsters come last, the decisions come first. And that is why Tolkien insists again and again that the true battle is not won at the Black Gate or the Hornburg, but in the slow, uncelebrated refusal to believe that domination is destiny. Where that refusal holds, no Uruk-hai can endure. Where it fails, they are already being bred. If this journey through Tolkien's world changed the way you see Middle-earth, consider subscribing to the channel. These stories are deeper than they seem, and there is much more buried meaning still waiting to be uncovered.